The salesman had driven 47 miles to make the offer in person. That was the first thing Ray Dunbar noticed when the truck pulled into his driveway on a Wednesday morning in February of 2007. The dealership was in Champaign. Ray's farm was outside Hoopeston. Nobody drives 47 miles on a February morning to make an offer they think will be turned down. They send a brochure, they make a phone call, they wait for you to come to them. When they drive 47 miles and knock on your door in winter, the offer is serious, and they know it, and they want you to know it before they say the number. The salesman's name was Craig Hollis. He was the commercial accounts manager for Midwest Green Equipment, the largest John Deere dealer in Vermilion County. He was 44 years old, well-dressed for farm country, and carried a folder that was thick enough to contain something more than a brochure. Ray invited him inside. Craig sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder and walked Ray through it in the methodical way of a man who has rehearsed the presentation enough times to know where the pauses go and which numbers to let sit before explaining them. The offer was a full fleet replacement package. Ray's 4 Massey Ferguson tractors, a 3095, a 5460, a 6480, and an 8480, plus his 2 Massey Ferguson combines, plus his planter and his tillage equipment, would be taken in trade at values Craig described as aggressive. Against those trade-in values, Ray would finance a new John Deere fleet, an 8530 as his primary tractor, a 7930 as his secondary, 2 utility tractors, and a new S670 combine. 0% financing for 24 months, fixed rate after that. The total package value before trade-ins was $340,000. Craig slid the summary sheet across the table and let Ray look at it. Ray looked at it for a long time. He looked at the trade-in values Craig was offering for his Massey Ferguson equipment. He looked at the financing structure. He looked at the total debt obligation the package would create. He looked at the payment schedule and what it assumed about commodity prices over the following 7 years. Then he slid the folder back across the table and said, "I'm not interested." Craig said he understood Ray might need time to consider. Ray said he didn't need time. He said the offer was fair, the equipment was good, and the financing was competitive, and he wasn't interested. Craig asked if there was a specific concern he could address. Ray said there wasn't a concern, there was a decision. The decision was no. Craig drove 47 miles back to Champaign. Ray went back to his equipment shed, where the Massey Ferguson 8480 was waiting for him to finish the preseason hydraulic inspection he'd been in the middle of when the truck pulled in. He picked up his wrench and went back to work. Ray Dunbar had been farming 860 acres in Vermilion County since 1989. The ground had come to him through a combination of inheritance and purchase. 280 acres from his father's estate, the rest acquired across 18 years of careful buying, each transaction timed to conditions that made the price right rather than conditions that made expansion feel necessary. He had run Massey Ferguson equipment since 1992, when he bought his first tractor of that brand at a dealer in Watseka, after spending 2 weeks looking at alternatives and arriving at a conclusion that had less to do with brand loyalty than with the specific machine he'd found, a well-maintained 3060, at a price that made the decision straightforward. The dealer had been honest. The machine had been what it appeared to be. The relationship had held across subsequent purchases, and by 2007 Ray was running a full Massey Ferguson fleet that had been assembled across 15 years of acquisitions, each one chosen on the same basis as the first. The right machine, at the right price, maintained to a standard that kept it reliable. The fleet was not new. The 3095 had 11,000 hours on it. The 8480, his primary tractor, had 8,000. The combines were mid-range in hours for their age. None of it was the kind of equipment that turned heads at the elevator or invited admiring conversation at the co-op. It was working equipment, used equipment, equipment that looked its age because it was its age, and Ray saw no reason to spend money making old iron look young. What the fleet was paid for, every piece of it. Ray had no equipment debt in February of 2007. He had no land debt either, The last payment on the final parcel he'd purchased had been made in 2004. His operating line was healthy, his cash reserve was real. He was, by any honest accounting, one of the most financially solid farm operations in the county. Craig Hollis had known this when he made the 47-mile drive. The commercial accounts department at Midwest Green Equipment tracked the financial profiles of large operations in their territory, and Ray Dunbar's profile was exactly the kind of profile that a good commercial salesman targets: debt-free, cash-rich, running aging equipment, theoretically ready for an upgrade. The logic was sound. The offer was structured well. On paper, it was the kind of deal that a rational farmer in Ray's position should have found difficult to turn down. What Craig had not accounted for was why Ray's position was what it was. He had not accounted for the fact that the financial solidity he was trying to leverage into a sale was the direct result of the decisions Ray had been making for 18 years. Decisions that included, as their central discipline, not taking on debt that the numbers didn't support. The 0% financing for 24 months was attractive. The rate after that was not. The payment schedule that followed assumed commodity prices that had been reasonable in 2006 and 2007 and would not be reasonable in 2009. Ray could see that. He'd been reading commodity markets and payment schedules for 18 years. He knew what the numbers assumed, and he knew what markets historically delivered, and he knew that the gap between assumption and delivery was where equipment debt became equipment crisis. He slid the folder back and said no and went back to his hydraulic inspection. And 12 months later, when the financial crisis arrived and commodity prices collapsed and credit tightened and operations carrying significant equipment debt began to feel the specific pressure that Ray had spent 2 decades engineering his operation to avoid, the decision made itself obvious in retrospect. But in February of 2007, it was just a no. A quiet, firm, unremarkable no. The kind of no that doesn't make news because it prevents news from happening. Craig Hollis went back to Champaign and did what commercial salesmen do when a good prospect declines a good offer. He noted it, filed it, and put Ray Dunbar on a follow-up schedule. He called in August of 2007 to ask if Ray's thinking had changed. Ray said it hadn't. He called in January of 2008 with a revised package, slightly different trade-in values, a longer 0% period. Ray listened to the full presentation over the phone and said no. The second call told Ray something that the first call had only suggested. When Craig came back with revised terms 6 months later, it confirmed that the dealership's interest in Ray's account was not casual. They had done the math on what a farmer with no debt and a full operating line could mean to their sales figures, and they had decided the account was worth pursuing at revised terms. That was a compliment, in its way. Ray understood it as a compliment. He also understood that the compliment was structured around the dealership's financial interest, not his, and that the revised terms, while better than the original ones, still created a debt obligation that his accounting did not support. He said no again, and meant it the same way he had meant it the first time, completely, without residual doubt, without the internal negotiation that a person has when they are not fully certain. Ray Dunbar was fully certain. He had been fully certain in February, and he was fully certain in January, and the additional 6 months of thinking that Craig's follow-up call implied Ray might have done had not produced any new information that changed the accounting. Craig called one more time, in September of 2008, 3 weeks after Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the credit markets seized, and agricultural lending began the rapid tightening that would define the next 18 months of farming finance across the Midwest. The call was brief. Craig said he understood things had changed, and he wanted Ray to know that Midwest Green Equipment was still committed to working with serious operators in the county. Ray thanked him and said he'd keep that in mind. He did not call back. There is a specific clarity that arrives when a decision made under uncertainty is confirmed by events. Ray had made the February decision without knowing what 2008 would bring. He had made it on the basis of what the numbers said and what markets historically did, and what he understood about the gap between financing assumptions and financial reality. He had not needed a crisis to validate the decision. The decision had been valid before the crisis arrived, but the crisis arrived anyway, and it validated the decision in the comprehensive and irrefutable way that only actual events can validate the projections that anticipated them. What was happening in Vermilion County in the fall of 2008 and through 2009 was what was happening in farm counties across the Midwest. The unwinding of the aggressive expansion and equipment upgrading that the boom years had funded, now that the funding had tightened and the commodity prices that had made the debt manageable had retreated to levels that made it less so. Ray watched it from the position of a man who had declined the 47-mile offer and continued running his paid-for Massey Ferguson fleet through planting and harvest and the grinding work of maintaining ground that was his, without obligation to anyone who might decide to review his credit line. 3 operations in the county that Ray knew personally had their operating credit reduced in 2009. One of them was Tom Vickers, who farmed 1,200 acres to Ray's north and had financed a full John Deere fleet upgrade in 2006. Tom's operating line was cut by 25% in the spring of 2009, forcing him to scale back his input rates on a third of his acres, a decision that cost him yield in a year when yield was already going to be the difference between a difficult year and a damaging one. Another was Gerald Marsh, who had expanded from 800 to 1,400 acres in 2007 on borrowed capital and financed new equipment to work the additional ground. Gerald's situation was more serious. By the fall of 2009, he was in restructuring conversations with 2 lenders simultaneously. He kept farming, but the operation that had looked like successful expansion in 2007 looked like overextension in 2009, because the difference between the two is not strategy, it is timing. And timing is determined by what the market does after you commit, not before. Ray Dunbar had a full operating line in the spring of 2009. He planted all 860 acres at full input rates. He finished on time. The Massey Ferguson 8480 pulled his planter through conditions that tested traction and did not fail. The combines ran through harvest without a mechanical stoppage that cost him more than a few hours. His yields were above county average. His margin, while thinner than the previous year, was positive. He did not discuss this at the co-op. He did not draw comparisons. He did his accounting and banked what was there to bank and maintained his equipment through the winter and prepared for the following season. By 2012, Ray Dunbar's operation had absorbed 2 difficult years, the credit tightening of 2009 and the drought of 2012, without restructuring, without asset sales, without conversations with bankers that he had not chosen to initiate. Tom Vickers had sold 160 acres in 2010 to reduce his debt load. He was still farming, but on a reduced scale, and the John Deere fleet he'd financed in 2006 was now a source of fixed cost pressure in years when fixed cost pressure was the thing that determined survival. Gerald Marsh had sold his operation entirely in 2011. The land went to a corporate entity. The equipment sold at auction for values that reflected the distressed circumstances of the sale. Gerald moved to his wife's family's property in another county. He did not farm again. Ray said nothing about either situation publicly. He attended Gerald's equipment auction, not to buy anything, but because Gerald had been his neighbor for 20 years, and it seemed right to be present. He stood at the back of the crowd the way he always stood at auctions, quietly, watching, not drawing attention, and watched machinery that had been purchased in the optimism of 2007 sell for fractions of its financed value in the necessity of 2011. He recognized the equipment. Some of it he had seen working Gerald's fields across the fence line for years. A Deere 8530, the same model that Craig Hollis had proposed for Ray's primary tractor in the February package, sold for $61,000. It had been purchased new for $114,000. The depreciation curve that the financing structure had not accounted for had done what depreciation curves do when they are not accounted for. The gap between what Gerald owed on the machine and what it brought at auction was a number that Gerald was now responsible for in ways that the original financing documents had described in fine print that optimism made easy to overlook. He thought about Craig Hollis and the 47-mile drive and the folder on the kitchen table and the $340,000 of financing that he had declined on a February morning 4 years earlier. He did not feel satisfaction about it. He felt the specific sobriety of a man who understands that the line between Gerald Marsh's outcome and his own was not intelligence or character. It was a decision made in 2007 that had required him to say no to something that looked attractive and was structurally dangerous. And the decision had been available to Gerald too, and Gerald had made a different one. Ray drove home from the auction. He went back to the shed. The Massey Ferguson 8480 had 12,000 hours on it. He'd rebuilt the injection pump the previous spring. The engine ran clean. He changed the oil and went inside. Craig Hollis left Midwest Green Equipment in 2013. Ray heard about it through the agricultural press. Craig had taken a position with a larger dealer group in central Illinois. The commercial accounts division at Midwest Green was restructured. A new manager called Ray in the spring of 2014 to reintroduce the dealership and ask about Ray's equipment plans. Ray said he didn't have immediate plans. The new manager asked if he could schedule a farm visit to discuss the new Massey. He caught himself. The new John Deere lineup. Ray said he'd keep the number. He did not call. What changed in 2014 was not Ray's equipment plans. What changed was that Midwest Green Equipment lost its Champaign location in a consolidation that reduced the dealership's footprint across the county. The nearest John Deere dealer was now 62 miles from Ray's farm. The Massey Ferguson dealer in Watseka, the one Ray had been buying from since 1992, was 18 miles away and still open. This was not a coincidence that Ray designed. It was a consequence of the same market forces that had been shaping his county's agricultural landscape since 2008. Dealerships that had expanded their infrastructure during the boom years on assumptions about sales volume that the post-crisis market did not support were contracting or closing, and the contraction was happening faster in brands whose customer base had been most damaged by the credit-financed upgrade cycle. Ray's Massey Ferguson dealer in Watseka had not been part of that cycle. Its customers skewed older, smaller, more conservative. They had not, on the whole, financed full fleet replacements in 2006 and 2007. They had maintained their equipment and bought when the price was right and carried less debt than their counterparts running other brands. And so they were still present as customers in 2014 when other dealers were counting empty slots in their service bays. Ray drove 18 miles to Watseka for parts. He had been driving 18 miles to Watseka for parts since 1992. The drive had not changed. In the spring of 2019, Ray Dunbar turned 61 years old. His operation covered 860 acres, all of it owned without debt. His equipment, the aging Massey Ferguson fleet that Craig Hollis had tried to replace 12 years earlier, had been supplemented with two careful used purchases in 2013 and 2017, both of them Massey Ferguson. Both of them bought at prices that reflected their actual value rather than their sticker value. Both of them maintained to the same standard Ray had applied to every machine he'd owned since 1992. The Massey Ferguson 8480, that had been his primary tractor when Craig sat at his kitchen table in 2007, had been retired in 2016 at 15,200 hours. Ray had sold it to a farmer in Ford County who put another 3,000 hours on it before trading it in 2021. The engine, original from the day Ray bought the machine, had never been opened beyond routine maintenance. Tom Vickers had retired in 2018. His son took over a portion of the land. The rest was leased to a neighboring operation. The John Deere fleet that had been financed in 2006 and had contributed to the credit crisis of 2009 had been replaced twice since then, each replacement financed, each financing creating the fixed cost structure that had shaped every difficult decision Tom had made in the years between. Ray saw Tom at the elevator in October of 2019, They talked about the harvest, about the weather, about the price of corn. Before Tom left, he said something that he appeared to have been considering for a while. He said, "Ray, I heard Craig Hollis came out here in '07 with a package deal. Full fleet, 340. Ray said, "He did." Tom said, "I got the same call. I took the deal." Ray said, "I know." Tom looked at him. He said, "You were right not to." Ray said, "I don't know that I was right. I just knew what my numbers could support." Tom said, "That's what right looks like in farming." He drove away. Ray finished his transaction at the elevator and drove home. The Massey Ferguson he'd been running that season, a 7726 he'd bought used in 2017 with 4,000 hours on it, was in the shed waiting for post-harvest maintenance. He went in, turned on the shed lights, and opened his maintenance log to the current page. He wrote down the date. He wrote down the hour meter reading. He noted the service items completed and the ones scheduled for the following week. He put the pen down and looked at the page. 27 years of maintenance logs, 27 years of Massey Ferguson equipment, maintained correctly, purchased at prices that reflected honest value, operated by a man who had declined a $340,000 deal on a February morning because the numbers told him to decline it, and the numbers had always been the thing he trusted. The shed was quiet. Outside, the October fields were done for the year. The grain was in. The equipment was parked. The accounting was clean. Ray closed the log and went inside. The dealers who had laughed, quietly, privately, the way dealers laugh at farmers who won't be sold, had been wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in ways that made for a satisfying confrontation. Just wrong in the slow, accumulating way that financial decisions are wrong when they don't account for what markets actually do over time, as opposed to what they're doing the year the deal is structured. Ray Dunbar had not proved them wrong by arguing. He had proved them wrong by farming. Season after season, with equipment that worked, on ground that was his, with numbers that stayed on the right side of the line he'd drawn in February of 2007, when he slid a folder back across a kitchen table and said he wasn't interested. He had never needed them to understand it. The books understood it. That had always been enough.